It's actually an ironic title, Black Marxism, because the whole book is an attack on Marxism. But he goes all the way back to Marx to make his argument against Marx and Marxism on race. He makes three arguments. One, that race is basically off of Marx's radar. That Marx is focused on the economy, and all these kind of social questions are off his radar. He says, as Marx's theoretical work proceeded, there was a progressive tendency to place the study of capitalist forms of production, exchange and distribution at the center of his work. It became more pronounced and more pronounced. By 1847, capitalism had become his primary subject. He didn't even care about revolutions. He wasn't interested in them because they, intruded on his work. His infrequent sojourns, Robinson writes, into the study of revolutions were dictated by, get this, their occurrence. As if they could be dictated by anything else. And the degree to which Marx believed them important testaments to the materialist conception of history. So it's off his radar. Second point is that he acknowledges that Marx does have something to say about nations and colonialism, some of these questions, but where they do talk, where Marx and his collaborator Engels do bother to talk about these questions, he says, look, they're off, they fail to have a comprehensive understanding. They're, as analysts of nationalism, for example, he says their legacy is at best ambiguous, his word. When dealing with actual nationalist movements of their time in Germany, Poland, Eastern, Southern Europe, neither Marx nor Engels achieved an extraordinary comprehension or fully escaped the parochialisms of their day. And take it even a step further, why were they so bad as analysts of nationalism? Why were they so off when they did bother to look at it? Robinson argues that basically, at base, the real reason is that, in his words, at its epistemological substratum, that is, at its most fundamental level, Marxism is a Western construction of conceptualization of human affairs and historical development that is emergent from the historical experiences of European peoples, mediated in turn through their civilizations, their social orders, their cultures. Now, this takes on an ominous significance, Robinson writes, since European Marxists have presumed more frequently than not that their project is identical with world historical development. Confounded, it would seem, by the cultural zeal that accompanies ascendant civilizations, they have mistaken for universal verities the structures and social dynamics retrieved from their own distant and more immediate past. They're European, they're white guys. They can't get it. Worse still, Robinson argues that they were racist, that they bought into chauvinism and nationalism. Their own nationalism, he says, whether unconscious or subconscious, made them generally unsympathetic to national liberation movements of peoples, Russians, Slavs, he throws out as an example, that historically threatened what Marx and Engels believed to be the national interests of the German people. Now, if you know anything about Marx and Engels, you know that that's a little bit ridiculous, maybe a lot ridiculous, as I intend to demonstrate, but it's actually a popular book and a popular argument, and other writers, as we'll see, borrow from it. Let's look at racial formation in the United States, only in one. I'm told that, I can't recommend it. I'm told that this is a popular undergraduate sociology reader on race. It's a horrible book. Basically, what they say is that the problem with Marxism is that it neglects the specificity of race as an autonomous field of social conflict. And now, if you're not used to that kind of like academic speak, it basically means that they're saying, leave race alone. You can't tie race to these other social phenomenons like Marxists do, like class or things like that. It's disconnected. You're disrespecting the autonomy of race and its specificity. The perspective of the class paradigm, racial dynamics, are just manifesting these more fundamental processes. They write, and only secondarily may they take on a life of their own or enjoy relative autonomy. And worse, only unwind and say that this is why the 60s went down in defeat. The 60s went down in defeat. Radical ideas failed, in part because they suffered from serious deficiency, largely because of their reduction, their words, reduction of race to other phenomena. So, let's go up to today. I don't have the book with me, but David Roediger wrote a book a couple years back called How Racism Survived U.S. History. Actually, a useful book. It goes through all these different periods in U.S. history, shows how racism changed at different points in time. He points out how elites used racism in all its malleable forms to their own benefit. But he's got a bone. He too has a bone to pick with Marxism, and you see how he picks up on this very same thread. He says Marxist writers, these are his words, have often lost track of the centrality of race in the development of U.S. capitalism because they too, he argued, gravitate toward the idea that labor is abstract and that mature capitalism is or should be colorblind. Now, just hold on. What is he really saying? He's saying because Marx has this method of treating different categories, commodities, labor, different aspects of society in an abstract way, and then trying to, define them and understand them in their separateness and as concepts, and then build towards a concrete picture of society and all of its complications. But because of that method of treating labor as abstract, that Marx is saying that mature capitalism is colorblind, which is kind of like what the capitalist classical economist says. And that's kind of what they say. And Roediger's saying Marxism, this is kind of like along the lines of Robinson, Marxism has its roots in that. He says because of its deep roots in classical capitalist political economy, it makes the adoption of the idea that capitalism undermines, like Marxism, slavery and racism, more than just incidental. In other words, Marx, it's like the idea, the capitalist idea, the economy's colorblind. The bosses don't care what color you are, they just see green, they just want money. And so he's saying Marx has that idea. And he even goes so far as to say, in a very, kind of putting the knife in, he says, because Marxists see labor as abstract, they have a tendency to lose track of, or to miss the bodies of the people actually performing the labor. Their bodies, their cultures, those are his points. And what I really want to show today is that all of these critiques are based on a straw man. So easy to set up and knock down. Not on Marx's actual politics. And I know it's a little bit off the beaten path of the prescription of readings and whatnot for this section, but you notice how all of these critiques that are so popular go back all the way to Marx. I find it's useful to go back to Marx. In fact, I asked Roediger about this when he came to Socialism in 2009. He spoke, he gave a very good talk, and I raised my hand and asked him about this. It wasn't the first thing I said, I said, this is a book, And then I said, but what about this issue you have with Marxism? Say more about it. And I'll paraphrase his response to me. He said, look, the world has changed since Marx's time, okay? So we shouldn't have this method. Marx got a lot of things right, but didn't get everything right. So we shouldn't have this method of going back to Marx for the answer for everything. Now, okay, he's right in a certain sense. Yes, of course the world has changed, and we can go a step further and say Marxism has changed since Marx's time. So it is possible that Marxism could have gotten something right that Marx himself personally got wrong. As I think we're going to see that's not true. But not being one who likes to do as I'm told, I decided to go back and look for the answer for everything in Marx. And I came upon this little gem in a used bookstore, Marx and Engels on the United States. Every syllable they ever uttered having to do with the United States, and it turns out they're rather vindicated. And I'll talk about those other books in a minute. But this is not just a defense of orthodoxy or something like that. This is an attempt to look at Marx's actual ideas, and I think we have much to learn from it. It sheds light on what Marxism actually is, and on what we can learn from the founders of the Marxist movement on this question. Let me just unpack a couple concepts for those who might be new to the ISO and to these study groups. Some terms that I would like to use. First is materialism. Marxism is sometimes known as historical materialism. What does that mean? The idea that ideas themselves don't just come out of thin air. They have some root in the real world, some root in material reality. Put it simply, if you don't eat, you can't have ideas. At a certain point, if you stop eating, you are going to stop having ideas. So yeah, that's a relative autonomy. Absolutely. No more eating, no more ideas. And therefore, the way you go about eating and figuring out how you're going to eat tends to have a large impact on your ideas, actually. And the way we go about eating, and the way we go about meeting our needs, which we call the economy, Marxists say forms the base of society, the material base, upon which we then tend to build a superstructure of political forms, laws, constitutions, religions, philosophies, and all of these kinds of things. Now, to this basic idea, though, we have to add dialectics. And not to get too mystical about it, but simply put, we have to recognize that the world is full of contradictions and embrace the fact that that's the way the world works, it's the way the world changes. That the causality, for example, cause and effect can change place. It's not just that the base causes everything in the superstructure. Sometimes that superstructure turns around and causes something in that base. It can flip places. And that there can be dynamics that contradict each other that can coexist at the same time in our world. And that's an important concept. Oh, the other thing that's important is about a dialectical understanding of materialism rather than, let's say, a mechanical or reductionist understanding, is that dialectics is hostile to reductionism. It's hostile to, it's anti-reductionist, if you will. We would never say, oh, you want to understand rivers? Look at this water molecule right here. Everything you need to know about the river is right here. Just look through the microscope at that water molecule. You'll understand rivers perfectly. No! But of course, if you get rid of water molecules, you cannot have a river, right? The relative autonomy. That the river has to be studied in its specificity, in its motion. It has laws and properties and all kinds of dynamics that the water molecule does not have. Okay? You cannot reduce the one to the other. There's all kinds of phenomena that take place at different levels of society without leaving off and saying, oh, rivers have nothing to do with water molecules. Like, no, they do have a lot to do with water molecules, but not everything. Right? They have their own, at a certain point, they have their own laws and dynamics. Similarly, we do not aspire to reduce every social question to an explication of the underlying class or economic factors or dynamics. Race and these other things that we're talking about are not the same thing as class. However, we believe that they arise on a material basis that we are attempting to describe. So we are hostile to the idea of reductionism. In fact, this concept that I'm kind of trying to speak right here, this is controversial while Marx and Engels were alive. It was controversial and misunderstood, such that Engels penned the following correction. According to the materialist conception of history, the ultimately determining element in history is the production and reproduction of real life. Eating. Other than this, neither Marx nor I have ever asserted. Hence, if somebody twists this into saying that the economic element is the only determining one, he transforms that proposition into a meaningless, abstract, senseless phrase. The economic situation is the basis, but the various elements of the superstructure, political forms of the class struggle and its results, constitutions established by the victorious class after a successful battle, legal forms, and the reflexes of all of these struggles in the brains of the participants, philosophic theories, religious views, and their further development into systems of dogmas all exercise their influence on the course of historical struggles, and in many cases preponderate in determining their form. The point is not that law, religion, or any other system of beliefs or ideology don't have a certain amount of logic of their own or a certain relative autonomy. The point is that we cannot explain how they change through history strictly on their own terms. You cannot understand how religions have come and gone or changed over time strictly by reading the Bible or the Torah or the religious texts themselves. You cannot understand why women, it was illegal for women to vote at one point in history, and then it's legal for them to vote. Just look at the law books, and that will explain why that law. No! You cannot understand it purely in terms of its own thing. It has some connection to other things going on in society, to things happening at the base. So let's take a concrete example, slavery and the origins of racism. Because I think for all three of those critics that I started with, sorry, hold on a second. Am I speaking too fast?
No.
For all of those critics that I just kind of started with, they, I think, all get it wrong, one way or another. Why were Africans enslaved? Well, we're accustomed to thinking that it's because the Europeans were racist. It seems so common sense. The Marxist case is actually the other way around. That the Europeans became racist because they enslaved Africans. That's a materialist attempt to explain the ideas rather than use the other way. You get what I'm saying. These categories, slavery and racism, we're used to thinking of them as like one concept. You have to kind of pull them apart for a second. Because they weren't actually linked in history. Historically, there have been tons of slavery that was not racialized. Ancient Romans, feudal slavery, all kinds of slaveries that were not racial slavery. And so we have to study the way that they actually became fused. They became fused in the colonies here in the New World, and it's borne out. Lance Selfa and other people have written very good summaries of the history of how the Virginia plantations evolved the concept of slavery. I'm just going to give it to you in a nutshell. Basically, first they tried to raise these incredibly profitable crops. They tried other people. They tried the Native Americans. Problem, you're in their house, They know it better than you. They can run away very easily. And also they died off. They died off in droves. They tried kidnapping people off the streets of Europe. They tried children, convicts. Problem. There's an industrial revolution blowing up in Europe, and you're sapping the labor force. Plus, those people, when they, earn their freedom, because after all, they're, claiming the rights of Englishmen, they become your competitors and try to set up shop on their own. And so they use all of these people, and they use them virtually like slaves. They use them as coerced labor in one form or another, and they turn to African slaves. But still, the concept of race, admittedly, even of our critics, did not have much meaning until there came to be a serious labor problem that they faced, which was the prospect of multiracial rebellions as part of it. In 1676, there was a big rebellion called Bacon's Rebellion, where, you just have to imagine, it's like they're co-workers, right? You're working on a plantation with people from Europe, with people with Native Americans, with Africans who've been kidnapped as well. That people grew close, people intermarried, people hung out, they drank, they got drunk together, and they fought back together. This one rebellion in 1676 forced the governor to flee Virginia, and they held out for almost a whole year. They held out, the rebels, 800 of them, until England sent some troops that were able to finally put it down. And it's for the first time the planters moved decisively toward using skin color as a decisive mark of degradation and slavery, is a practical purpose, in other words. And these people can never run away anywhere. You can't run away from your skin color. It's brilliant, right? It's a perfect way. You always know who the slaves are anywhere you go, because they're marked for life as such. Racism, the idea that Africans were an inferior species, was a new idea, and one that also is bound up with the whole crucible of the American Revolution and the new ideas that were coming with the bourgeois revolutions. Let me just stop for a minute and say something about Omi Wyman, because as much as they criticize Marxism for infringing on the autonomy of race, their explanation for the origin of racism is that it was practically useful in the endeavor of enslaving the native population. So they refer to something outside of the scheme of race itself. They commit the sin that they abhor. Roediger basically says that he agrees that plantation slavery and the slave trade is the origin. But I think in doing so, he concedes that labor is abstract as a concept, that it wasn't always racialized, and that it actually becomes racialized at a specific moment. Again, contradicting himself. But it's Robinson that I want to dwell on for one more second, because Robinson argues that racism is older. Robinson disagrees that the New World slave trade is the origin of racism in the modern sense. He thinks it's older, and then it goes back to feudalism. He refers to all kinds of feudal hatreds and myths about other peoples, and it's all part of his argument that there is an epistemological substratum of European thought that's racist and that Marx and Engels are bound up with. But I don't think his telling is compelling because of the way he says the feudalism, that the transformation of capitalism wasn't really a big deal. He basically says it's not a big deal that everybody's making it out to be. All these feudal ideas were transmitted wholesale into the new capitalist order, and I think he misses the importance and the earth-shattering nature of the bourgeois revolution, which explains to me so powerfully why racism is so important. In other words, people had been enslaved before in world history for eons, but you never needed to explain it. That was the natural state of affairs, that you were the servant and so-and-so was the king. The king didn't have to be explaining himself to you, right? You were his subject. For the first time in world history, the world promised that everyone would be equal. The world had never promised that to every lowly serf, to every single person working in the fields. The world had never reached down to every person and said, you are just as equal as a king. That's what the bourgeois revolution promised. A total reworking of ideas in the world came with, naturally, a total reworking in the material organization of how people ate and fed themselves and organized themselves to meet their needs. That was brand new, and it's only in that context that you have to explain why these people are still wearing ankle bracelets and working on plantations. You have to explain it, right? You never needed to do that before. Barbara Fields writes, comparing slavery in Russia. She says, because Tsarist Russia had no conception of absolute equality resting on natural law, It did not need as consistent or radical a version of absolute inequality resting on natural law as developed in the United States in the wake of the Revolution, when self-evident laws of nature guaranteed freedom. Only equally self-evident laws of equally self-evident nature can account for its denial. And hence, the newness of racism is an idea that by nature, these people are forever, for life, different and not worthy of those things. Okay. So let's go on to Marx. Let's get to this. Marx. Sorry. Now look, it's true. Marx never wrote like a book on race or a work where it's just like, what did Marx say on race? Let's go to the book, Marx on race. It doesn't exist. And that's true. But I would say that that there's a couple of things we can look at. One, we can look at a collection of articles, letters, speeches, writings, notes. And in addition to that, I want to bring out a record of activism, of what Marx did on the question. So I'm going to start with the question of the colonial world and national liberation and those questions, because I think it shows something about Marx's method, Marx and Engels' method, and how it changed over time. And then I want to go specifically to slavery and racism. Let's start with the colonial question. Robinson says, oh, Russian liberation, that Polish liberation, they had no feeling for it, they had no comprehensive understanding. In fact, they were hostile to it. Cut to Marx and Engels speaking alongside Polish revolutionaries at several left-wing events organized all around London by the Chartist movement, the trade union movement, held to commemorate the 1830 Polish uprising, which they saw, in their words, quote-unquote, as a point of honor for all Democrats, people fighting for democratic rights, in Europe. That's a little there. And at one such event, Engels said from the stage, and I quote, "A nation cannot be free and at the same time continue to oppress other nations. The liberation of Germany cannot therefore take place without the liberation of Poland from German oppression." Thank you. Far from unsympathetic. They consider it a point of honor. The British rule in India, and Edward Said and other people are famous for attacking Marx on this, because you can take sections of, phrases from Marx and make it sound like he's a cheerleader for colonialism, for, industrial development and this kind of thing. But the more you read Marx, the more Marx developed over time, the more he came out clearly and squarely for the revolt of the colonial subjects against their masters. He came out against British colonialism, despite their bringing modern technology and whatnot. He said that they will neither emancipate nor materially mend the social conditions of the mass of people. He's talking about India. He says, depending not only on the development of the productive powers, but on their appropriation by the people. But what they will not fail to do is lay down the material premises for both. It's contradictory. Has the bourgeoisie ever done more? Has it ever affected a progress without dragging individuals and people through blood and dirt, through misery and degradation? And then, actually, their position went even a step further and said, look, it's not even about a revolution happening in England. They said it's more likely that the Hindus, in their word, are going to throw off the English yoke altogether, that it's going to come from them. Likewise, they supported the backward Algerians in their struggle against the European French colonizers. And they said that the French colony was the arena of unceasing bloodshed, rape, violence. This barbarous system of warfare has been persisted in by the French against all dictates of humanity and civilization. In fact, the French general that was leading that occupation was the same one who had put down the French troops in 1848. But Marx and Engels didn't think that people had to wait for their liberation from somebody else, including colonial subjects. And look at what they had to say about the Irish as a colonial possession of England. And I think this quote also shows the way they understand that these national questions have a reverberation in terms of consciousness and prejudices and the social questions that we're told Marx is oblivious to. It says, every industrial and commercial center in England possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps: English proletarians and Irish proletarians. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the Irish, no, of the English working class, despite its organization. It is the secret by which the capitalist maintains its power, and that class is fully aware of it. In other words, the class struggle ain't gonna even happen in England unless this Irish question and its concurrent prejudices are dealt with. Those have to be dealt with first. And so I think we begin to lay out a picture of Marx as a much more dialectical, a much more dynamic and broad-minded thinker. It's not like he's just looking at Europe and then falsely generalizing to the rest of the world, but it's somebody who is looking at the entire world and understands that sometimes the priorities in terms of the dynamics of the struggle for human freedom don't always occur within the gates of a European factory. They were for socialist liberation, but they're supporting all kinds of struggles that are short of socialist workers' struggle fighting to control the economy. And with this in mind, let's turn specifically to the question of slavery and racism, what Marx and Engels said and did. What follows are 5 reasons why everything that I laid out at the beginning of the talk is wrong about Marx and Engels. First, I'm gonna take a lighter. Okay. 5 reasons that all of that is wrong about Marx. 1, Marx did not accept, and this is, I think, very advanced for his day. Marx did not, because one could have an idea that's like, oh, those poor Africans, somebody got to do something for them. They really are, people are really messy. The abolitionist movement had a wing that was like very condescending, looked down. Marx did not even accept that the whole idea and the ideology of racism about Africans was true. Listen to what he said. What is a Negro slave? A man of the black race. The one explanation is worthy of the other. Ouch. Whoa. It sounds like he's buying into racism, and people take that quote and bandy it about, except they don't read the sentences that follow. A Negro is a Negro. Only under certain conditions does he become a slave. Example 2. A cotton spinning machine is a machine for spinning cotton. Only under certain conditions does it become capital. Torn away from these conditions, it is as little capital as gold is itself money, or sugar is the price of sugar. And now you see those first sentences are mocking the idea. He's mocking the idea that a Negro slave is a man of the black race, that the one explanation is as good as the other. And in fact, he's advancing, in a very compressed number of words, a social explanation. He's saying, no, all of these attributes that we're told are intrinsic to the Negro are actually social attributes. That it's only under certain social conditions that the Negro has become a slave. That is very advanced for somebody in the 19th century. He argues, so clearly, first of all, we can just knock out of the park the idea that for Marx, race was some kind of a blind spot, all right? He was totally and squarely opposed to what he called, in his words, the loudly proclaimed principle that only certain races are capable of freedom. Second, Marx had an analysis of the social purposes of racism. He saw in the situation of black and white laborers in the New World a parallel between the Irish and the English workers that we described before. From that same passage, he goes on to say, the ordinary English worker hates the Irish. Okay, why? As a competitor who lowers his standard of life. His attitude is much the same as that of the poor whites to the niggers in the former slave states of the USA. This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers. In short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling class. Wow. So not only is he conscious and understanding that there's a prejudice, a feeling between two people that's there, and he's acknowledging it and trying to describe it, but he understands the source of it, that it's kept alive by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, and that it has some basis in a reality. It's not just, they can just put out anything in the comic papers and people believe it. It has some soil in which it lands. Those ideas land in the soil of the competition between the workers themselves, the way that they're constantly competing with each other in capitalist society. And we should just pause for a minute and mention that this very practical explanation of the purpose of racism, that is, as an effective way to divide the laboring population, dare we say this economic reason for the persistence of racism, is not to say that then that explains everything about racism. Does it explain everything about the experience of racism? Certainly does not. Any more than studying a water molecule explains everything about the river, right? But it's just to begin. It's just to sketch out a beginning, a framework for understanding why racism persists, and to just go further on the experience, the question of personal experience. Let's look at Marx's personal experience. White guy, true, German, Jewish, born to a fairly prosperous family, studied law. I think his father was a rabbi. Never set foot in the United States. Never even saw a plantation. Let's take another individual, Frederick Douglass. Born a slave. Only vague memories of his mother, who visited him 3 or 4 times at night after walking about 14 miles to do so. Was raised to be a slave. Physically fought his master on his way to figuring out a plan to escape, and won that fight. The master backed off from whipping him. Escaped on his own, taught himself to read and write, and lived his entire life in the United States. Totally different experiences. Totally different experiences. And in fact, experiences, of course, dictated by all the peculiarities of race. And yet, when it comes to the question of why racism, of the social structure of racism, of its purpose in life, the words of one could have been written by the other. Despite that, in words that could have been written by Marx, Douglass argued that hostility between the whites and blacks of the South is easily explained. It has its root and sap in the relation of slavery, that was incited on both sides, poor whites and the blacks, by putting enmity between them. They divided both to conquer each. They succeeded in drawing off the minds of the poor whites from the real fact that by the rich slave master, they are already regarded as but a single remove from equality with the slave. That man grew up in slavery, as a slave, I wrote that. Okay, third. Marx certainly did not think that European workers or somebody else was going to have to come and rescue African slaves. A la what we saw his attitude in the colonial world, the Irish question. Marx had an eye to the activity of the slaves themselves. And by the way, this is still a controversial point. If you read the New York Times, and it's driven from the Civil War, a lot of it. I mean, the idea is a cultural distance between the two that explains it. I mean, this is some silly stuff. But Marx put his finger on it from the jump, that the whole conflict was about slavery. And not only that, which was amazingly appreciative of him, but not only that, but he had his eye on the activity of the slaves themselves. And that whole question, which Du Bois rescued in Black Reconstruction, the role of slaves in that whole process, is pointed to by Marx. Check this out. He says, well, let me get to that. I ran ahead. He says in the United States, in the United States of America, every independent movement for workers is paralyzed. It's very similar to what he's saying about the English workers, paralyzed as long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin, where in the black it was branded. And if you want an kind of economic determinist, a crude economic analysis, in Marx's day, the magazine that's still around today, The Economist of London, their analysis of the Civil War was, first of all, it's not about slavery. Second of all, to the extent that it is about slavery, capitalism, the laws of capitalism itself are going to roll over slavery, and so we don't have to worry. All this abolitionism is so much wasted breath. And Marx actually took up a polemic with them on that point. He disagreed. He pointed out, for example, that in 1859 they imported, right before the Civil War, they imported more slaves than in any other year, and it was still profitable up until the end. But here's to the thing about identifying the actions of slaves themselves. He wrote in an often overlooked letter to Engels, Marx wrote, "In my view, the most momentous thing happening in the world today is the slave movement. On the one hand, in America, started by the death of John Brown, and in Russia on the other. I've just seen in the Tribune that there's been another slave revolt in Missouri, which was put down, needless to say, but the signal has now been given." Well, anyway, go on. I'm running short on time. I just think it's important to step back for a minute and understand Marx is slandered as eurocentric, economistic, and this is very difficult to square with the same guy who supported the Algerians against the French, the Hindus against the English, and pointed to the self-activity of the plantation slaves as the key to the developments that were going on in the New World. Here, let's take a quick quiz. Who said this? Malcolm X or Frederick Engels? The slave has, in every condition, the right, and in certain conditions, the duty to free himself by every means possible from slavery. My fourth point. I just want to quickly say something about Marx's developmentism. Chris Williams addressed this in his book, Ecology and Socialism. You know, Marx, cheerleader for industry, rolling over the bones of colonial peoples. False. But I want to go back to that point that Broder made, that, you know, for Marx, labor is abstract, and he forgets about the bodies and cultures of people actually performing the labor. This quote, which I can scarcely read without tears coming to my eyes, I think should banish from our brains that slander about Marx forever. I'm sorry that it's a little long, but let me read it. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the indigenous population of that continent, the beginnings of the conquest and plunder of India, and the conversion of Africa into a preserve for commercial hunting of black skins, are all things that characterize the dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. The treasures captured outside Europe by undisguised looting, enslavement, and murder flowed back to the mother country and were turned into capital there. Direct slavery is as much the pivot upon which our present-day industrialism turns as our machinery, credit, etc. Without slavery, there would be no cotton. Without cotton, there would be no industry. It is slavery which has given value to the colonies. It is the colonies which have created world trade, and it is world trade which is the necessary condition of large-scale machine industry. In fact, the veiled slavery of the wage laborers in Europe needed the unqualified slavery of the New World as its pedestal. Capitalism comes dripping from head to toe from every pore with blood and dirt. Take that, Roder. And of course, we see that instead of pointing to capitalism as the thing that's going to, just by dint of economic law, get rid of slavery, he's saying it's capitalism, slavery is capitalism's pedestal. Fifth, last point, and then I'm done. Marx and his comrades actively campaigned during the Civil War on the side of the North. It's an impressive record of activism. Let me just give you some highlights. In 1863, and this is a time to just flash the books. Marx, Tocqueville, and Race in America by August Nibs Jr. If you care nothing for Tocqueville, you can just skip through those parts. But he goes through the impressive record of activism in this book, and it's a very important read. I highly recommend it. In 1863, Marx helped to organize the largest of what were many, many anti-slavery meetings that were going on in London. This was a mass movement in England, and Marx was a leading activist in it. Now, English manufacturing, of course, was working up the raw materials from the New World plantations. And so the English ruling class, the factory owners, they were unanimous in their support for the South, for continuing slavery. In fact, not only that, they were drawing up plans to intervene in the American Civil War on the side of the South. What stopped them? The British working class. Even though they were losing their jobs, even though their livelihoods depended on it, they rose. I mean, it's just an amazing story, the way that they rose in defense on the side of the North. It's amazing. The anti-interventionist sentiment and movement rights Nibs, Marx felt, was the decisive factor in preventing the British government from coming to the Confederacy's defense. In English, in essence, the English working class's finest hour. That movement gave birth. That's what gave birth to the International Working Men's Association, which we know is now the first international. They didn't call it that at the time. They didn't know it. Marx was invited to participate in the International's founding meeting in 1864. Nibs writes, Marx immediately threw himself into getting the new organization off the ground and soon emerged as its de facto leader. The general rules which he drafted stipulated not only how members should behave toward one another, but all men, without regard to color, creed, or nationality. And on behalf of the International, it was Marx who drafted a congratulatory letter to Lincoln. I don't know if people know that Marx wrote a letter to Lincoln on behalf of the First International, congratulating him on his re-election. Again, this is Marx compressing an enormous number of ideas into a teeny tiny amount of space. Now you understand Lincoln was very hesitating, in terms of the question of overdoing slaves, very hesitant, and the events themselves push him along that path. Marx hints at this and kind of nudges Lincoln. He says, "Sir, we congratulate the American people upon your re-election by a large majority. If resistance to the slave power was the reserved watchword of your first election, the triumphant war cry of your re-election is death to slavery." And then he directly addresses this whole question of race prejudice and how it's harmful to the working class of all races in the letter to Lincoln. He says, "While the working men, the true political powers of the North, allowed slavery to defile their own republic, while before the Negro, mastered and sold without his concurrence, they boasted it the highest prerogative of the white-skinned laborer to sell himself and choose his own master. While that state of affairs is obtaining, they were unable to attain the true freedom of labor or to support their European brethren in their struggle for emancipation. This barrier to progress has been swept off by the Red Sea of war." And I'll just end, if I can just say one last thing, which I think people will enjoy hearing, is that many of the refugees from the German Revolution's direct relations and comrades of Marx who emigrated to the United States, where they settled and hung out, not only was Marxism strong, but anti-racism was strong. These are like German-speaking communities in places like Cincinnati. Here is an account of, one of these guys, August Willich, led a giant, when John Brown was killed, he led a giant multiracial march through the streets of Cincinnati. And I won't read you the whole quote about it because I'm being told to wrap up. But it's an amazing speech that he gives in front of this multiracial crowd, and a hostile spectator watches with shock as he denounces the Democrats and slavery. And the spectator says the woolly heads were, all excited. Furthermore, Nims writes, when the Civil War itself broke out, all the communist clubs that they had started, they liquidated them. I mean, they had their priorities straight. And they joined the Union Army immediately. And in fact, several of them rose to prominence. They fought with such distinction. August Wiedemeyer became a colonel, I think, in the Union Army. And August Willich, again, became a major general. In the first and only time a communist has ever been a general in the U.S. military. He had the respect and affection of the common soldiers under him because he shared their privations, was always in the lead when the fighting was thickest, and treated them like men, not dogs. On returning to camp, he would put his troops at ease, address them as citizens, and proceed to lecture on socialism. We get from Marx that racism is not eternal, that it has economic roots. We get who benefits from Marx. We get that its persistence is explained by the fact that it's part of the ruling ideas of society. And finally, to the extent that racism, if we identify it as something essential to the functioning and maintenance of the capitalist system, then we also, people opposed to capitalism, get from Marx the urgency in prioritizing the fight against racism. Thank you.